Steve, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Okay, you're happy to be here. I am so happy that you're here because what the people watching, the ones at least who come from my side of the social media sphere, may not know. For many years, I was the host of a podcast on personal productivity, but underneath the podcast that no one talked about is I was actually deeply interested and am deeply interested in how people think, in cognition and neuroscience, and how we make decisions or don't make decisions. And when I saw you on LinkedIn and I saw that you take actual neuroscience and apply it to the business world and find ways to help people use research based, brain based techniques to succeed and have a better work life, I was like, yes, kindred spirit. She's wonderful. She's amazing. Must have a conversation with her. So,
Uh,
uh, tell me about you and what you're going to talk about, and let's just
yeah.
jump right in.
I love it. Yeah, thank you. No, I'm so pleased to be here. To your point, that's exactly what I'm passionate about is taking applied neuroscience and making people's lives better and easier. And they say that research is me search, and this is definitely true. Is because I needed to understand how we could create a circumstance where we were using the science in a way that we weren't creating longer days, but we were more effective, more productive, et cetera, right? And so I have a couple of programs where I offer this to the public. So one of them is called Boost My Business Brain, and the other one is called Influence and Leadership Presence. And they're two different, what I call pillars of learning that basically applied neuroscience, one dedicated to how you as an individual contributor can be more productive, effective, motivated. The second is how you can, as a manager, leader, be
Brynn,
more influential.
could you hang on 1 second? I don't know
I
if it's happening
can.
on your end, but I'm having my images flip back and forth here, and I
Agreed. I
don't
see
know
it.
what's
Yeah.
going on. Okay, I see it too, and my little control panel, which of course is supposed to be so transparent that um, uh, that everything just magically works perfectly. Turns out everything doesn't magically work perfectly. Who the heck knew? Okay, I 1 second. My apologies to our watchers. This is what we call. This is how you know that we're actually
Yeah,
going to
but it's live.
take you off it. There we go. All right. And
Okay,
now if I do that,
cool.
perfect. Let us continue.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Well, anyway, I'll just say that I do have these two programs, and it's kind of, I draw from things that were personally relevant, certainly, in my work life and in my corporate life and in my professorship. So that's the research that I do now. Without further ado, let's talk today. I have four
Yes.
insights, okay? And so I divide them up in do's and don'ts. And I'm actually going to start with the don'ts. And I call them my brain-based do's and don'ts for the new work reality. Because the truth is that we are just leaving that, COVID pandemic timing. People are going back to the office. A lot of people finding themselves in work hybrid models, right? Where like you're spending some time virtual, some time in the office. So I really wanted to think a little about that and about how it is that people can, as they return to work, as they return to the office, make their lives a little simpler. So let me start with the don'ts, okay? I have two of those for you. The first don't is to what I say is to don't ignore your neural flow. What do I mean by that? Well, humans, as most of us know, have a circadian system, right? That works 24 hours. It's the ebb and flow of the hormonal chemistry in your body, and it demarcates things like light and dark, night and day, wake and sleeping hours. And no surprise that it is a 24-hour cycle. And we used to think that the brain worked accordingly. But actually, what we know now is that the brain works according to what we call the ultradian cycle. There's no test. You don't need to remember that. Let's just call it the neural flow. But in that neural flow, we know that it doesn't work 24-hour cycles. It works something closer to about 90-minute cycles. And when this research was first sort of discovered and published in the 80s, we knew that as an example, we thought that on a really hypothetical level, the brain really had about 90 minutes of working attention span, followed by what was going to be a requisite healing response rest time of 20 minutes. But what many neuroscientists have shown is that actually that's condensed over the last 25 years, 30 years. And technology has served to do that. Lots of things have served to do that. But it has shortened our actual productive window within which our head wants to work, our brain wants to work. And so, yeah, yeah. And
That's
so
kind of maddening.
kind of maddening and very frustrating if you're trying to get things done. And so people will often come to me and say, I think I have like geriatric ADHD. I'm like, no, you don't. You just have a different circadian circadian cycle than you once did even. And so what we think is that that has now been condensed from 90 minutes of productivity, 20 minutes of rest time or healing response, down to about 45 minutes of productivity. And the healing response is still pretty similar. It's still about 15 minutes. So what we see is sort of neatly packed into 1 hour. On any given hour, you're only likely to be productive neurocognitively for about 45 minutes. And then for 15 minutes, you need to have a break. You need to take a rest. And so really important to think of yourself, first of all, as a neurochemical system, right? Your brain is not a marathoner. It's like your day is a series of sprints. You need to take more breaks. And really think about how it is that you can break up your day's schedule so that you are honoring your neural flow, or said differently, not ignoring that neural flow.
So, one thing as you say that is coming to mind is, at least with 45-15, that rounds out to a nice even 1 hour. Whereas with 90 and 20, it's like, oh, that's an hour. That's like way easier to deal with this way. However, are we actually going to feel as good doing 45 minutes and 15? Like, when you say that, there was a part of my brain saying, no, I could never take that much time off. How could I possibly be productive under that scenario? Am I really gonna find that?
It's a good question. There's two schools of thought. That one is that you probably don't need that much time off first thing in the morning. So I call it the neurochemical magic of mornings. It's likely that you start needing much more break time as the day wears on. As you and I both know, there comes that moment at 2:30, 3:30, 4 o'clock. You think, I'm done, I'm cooked. And that's what's happening to you. Yeah. The second piece about that is that some of the theorists basically believe that whether you're taking the break or not, your brain demands it. And so it starts to do things like, and you and I both know how this feels, Steve, it starts to do things like gap out or daydream or lose your train of thought, right? Like your brain just takes the break, even if you didn't want to or ask to or give it that opportunity. So
is that why I go to social media? Like is that would that be one of the escape hatches? Is that for someone like me who chronically finds myself going to social media, that maybe my brain is hitting that point, and it's, since I can't concentrate on the main thing anymore, I'm kind of going, must still keep stimulated somehow, as opposed to just going, you know what, why don't I just meditate for 15 minutes?
Exactly. And some people, it is meditation. But yeah. And for me, it's definitely not social. I try to avoid that at all costs. But it's, to your point, it's your brain's need to distract itself and to say, you know what, I still need to stay active somehow. I need to do something somehow, but I'm not feeling this work that I'm trying to focus on, trying to concentrate on. So it's exactly that. And it's a very good question too, Steve, because it really leads me into my second don't, which is, when I talk about not ignoring your neural flow and not doing things that are too self-distracting, really though, when you got to give yourself a break. You got to say, listen, if I got to get up and go for a walk, if I have to use my social media, go ahead. My second don't for you is to expect too much. Don't expect too much, both of yourself and of others. And let me explain what I mean by that. When we're too hard on ourselves, we decrease any of our performativity and productivity. So that's the first thing. If you find yourself doing something you think non-productive, don't berate yourself, because the more that you put way too heavy expectations on yourself, the more we see something called expectancy violations. And expectancy violations are what I consider to be, and what I often say is, a neurochemical disaster. When what we see is that you expected yourself to produce and perform and be productive and be motivated, and you're not, what we see is decrements in self-efficacy, in self-confidence, in stamina, energy, motivation, productivity, locus of control, like you're a lot less internally and intrinsically motivated, and you feel like the world is, conspiring against you. So we see that is a neurochemical sort of downward spiral, if you will. So you don't want to expect too much of yourself. But as we return to offices, you also don't want to have expectancy violations when it comes to other people. And that is one of the things that I think is a big deal when we look at, especially a lot of friction between colleagues. What we see often is that people who expected way too much of others then get irritated, hostile, angry, unhappy. And that is we're going to talk about one more, but one of the lead causes for friction between people. So I think not expecting too much, right? Really trying to right size your expectations of self and of other is another kind of neurocognitive trick you can use to help yourself be more productive, because then you're not berating yourself and you're not looking at other people thinking, you know what, that person's really slacking off, really making my life difficult. I'm really having a hard time with them today, as example.
and and of course, if you're thinking that about them, and if you let them know that you're thinking that about them, that's just going to trigger them to be feeling even suckier. What do you do about the fact that bosses and managers, bosses and managers through time immemorial have had unrealistic expectations of what people could do? But it sounds like we may be going back into an environment where when we're at home, our rhythms have changed, and they've been changing for years anyway. And when we get back into the office, how do we manage the expectations up and down
Yeah, well,
of those who work for us and
it's an
those
amazing
who we work for?
question. Yeah, it's such an amazing question. And it really comes to, it's one of my do's actually. So if you want me to answer that through a do, I would love permission, Stever.
Let's do it. See what I did there?
Because, thank you, I love what you did there. Because one of my do's is to identify and communicate your boundaries. And let me say it this way. It's the mark of self-reflexive, self-aware people, certainly, that they understand what their boundaries are. But the second piece, and to answer your question, it's impossible for you to manage up or manage down. So what your boss is expecting of you or what you expect of the people that work with and for you. It's very hard to manage that if you're not self-aware about what your boundaries are and what you really need in order to operate, what you think is a realistic expectation of yourself. And let me say that what's definitely happened over the course of the last 18 months, and we have great research to show, is that everyone has changed, which I'll talk about next. But the second piece is that people have, really changed in terms of their triggers, their parameters, their boundaries, the way that they, want to operate and want to do work. And one of the things we call that when this goes south, when people don't get along because there are boundaries that have been sort of, crossed at work, we call that a boundary transgression. And it's the number one cause of colleague friction. And it effectively comes from similar to an expectancy violation. It's the difference between how you're being treated or what's being asked of you and what you expect of yourself or what you expected in terms of how to be treated. And so what
Can
we
you give it
need
like
to do,
a specific example of what that would be?
sure. Imagine that your boss expected you to come to work newly back post-COVID. They expect you to come to work for 7 a.m. like yesteryear. And you've now changed. You've changed over 18 months. That's not how you've set up your day from your home office. It's not what you've been up to. And so now you're thinking that 7 a.m. that was true in 2019 is just not reasonable anymore. That's not an expectation. It's not a parameter for work. In fact, it's an obstacle for me. That's a boundary now because you've redesigned your sleep or you've redesigned how you do your work during the day. And so what we see is that let's say that expectation remains the same, that would then become a source of conflict or friction between yourself and your boss is a good example. And so it's that we're managing.
Okay, and so I would recognize that in myself through like feelings of exasperation or I'm thinking I still remember reading back when people were first starting to return to the office a few months ago, and I forget the head of some bank in New York said, well, anyone who doesn't show up, is clearly, not going to be advancing in their career or something like that. And I just remember thinking, wow, great way to get your employees to want to come running back to the office. It's like I wanted to quit and I didn't even work there.
Hence the great exodus, right? People quitting in droves is because they suddenly realize that there's a lot of things that are new triggers for them, new boundaries for them, new parameters for work that weren't true, or that, in yesteryear that they kind of had taken for granted or that they just kind of fell into as convention, as normalized work life, that now will be different. And so to your point, I think it's very important that not only would you as an individual, the mark of a good manager is someone with enough self-reflexivity and awareness to know what their boundaries are and what their requirements will be, but truly a mark of a good leader is one who's watching for it in other people. And so to your point, a leader who says that type of thing is probably not poised then to have great retention or to be pleasant to work with necessarily, because people change so much. And so another piece of that I think that's important to know is that you really can't expect as an individual vying for yourself and advocating for yourself at work and protecting kind of your psychological safety and your happiness and your work-life balance. You can't expect others to respect you and to honor your boundaries and your new parameters if you don't, first of all, know what they are, and then second of all, communicate them. And so I often say, if you don't have enough self-respect to do that, then you can't expect others to respect you that way as well.
Wow. So we basically need a crash course in introspection, knowing ourselves, identifying our boundaries, because it's changed, but we don't necessarily realize it's changed until we're forced back into the situation. And
Exactly.
then, oh, see, I thought it
Mhm.
was stressful just to be caught at home for a while. And now it's turning out that it's not just stressful to be caught at home, but weirdly, it's now also stressful to think about going back. So we've kind of set the situation up where this is not a recipe for enlightenment or equanimity.
Well, and
It's
okay, I love what
it's
you're saying because and this is my second do, and it comes, so this is a perfect kind of a, question or comment, Stever, is that to your point, when we had to change into working from home, people were uncomfortable. There were so many distractions. People were having such a hard time kind of weeding out all the distractions and figuring out their work scenario and their schedule and their parameters, and it felt uncomfortable. But now imagine that we're asking you to change again. Okay, so we're asking you to come into the offices again, to on the back though of what we consider to be VUCA circumstances for the last 18 months. So now imagine that everything was going concern, business as usual, please go and work from home virtually. Now you've been under duress for 18 months. And so in VUCA circumstances, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which nothing quite like a global pandemic and a whole bunch of closed economies to create
for example, yes.
mental chaos, right? Yeah, exactly. So now we're asking you on the back of that mental chaos to change again. And that change then is not only going to be very hard to stomach because we are not basically, our coffers are depleted, right? We just don't feel as psychically or physically, emotionally, cognitively as fortified as we might have even in 2019. And so what we can expect then, and what I say one of my last do for you, if you will, is do expect and embrace significant change when it comes to returning to the office, both in yourself and in others. Let me qualify this for you. You've changed more in the last 18 months than you have in the whole of your last decade. Maybe unless your life was really tumultuous or something in the last decade, then maybe. But on average, we can expect that you've changed more in the last 18 months than as things were going concern, business as usual over the last decade. Why? Because VUCA circumstances, people under duress, people who find themselves in contexts that are volatile, uncertain, complex, or ambiguous, we actually see an acceleration in two things. The first is neurogenesis, which is the birth of new neurons, which actually we don't see in adults very often unless they've just given birth. Otherwise, it's the job of knowledge and learning and wisdom and memory networks to prune away old neurons and get rid of them. So neurogenesis is something that we see uniquely in people either who've just given birth or who are under duress. The second thing we see is an acceleration in neuroplastic change. And so what's interesting is you and me, Stever, we were with ourselves every day, right, over the last 18 months. We were changing a lot. We were under duress. Our brains were rewiring themselves. But we didn't feel it because it's so incremental on a day-to-day basis that you don't really acknowledge. We're not usually typically self-aware enough to notice how much we've changed. But the best part of this is that we definitely, when we return to offices, we're already seeing great research pop up that demonstrates other people have changed more than we expected them to as well. So not only do we underestimate how much we've changed, we completely overestimate how similar or same people will be from their 2019 selves, when in fact they've changed too, as have their boundaries. So this is my final do for you today, which is the do of embracing and expecting change in yourself and in others, because this is a very unique scenario where you've changed more than in the last 10 years, very likely, and that has given rise to more neurogenesis, more neuroplasticity. Here's the dangling carrot. If there's a reason to embrace
I
change,
was actually,
yeah, why
I'm
would
glad
you
there
do
is a
this?
carrot because
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking like, wow, this is great. So my brain has rewired itself to be a gigantic bundle of stress and missed expectations. That's not how I wanted to proceed forward in my life necessarily. So what can we
Or
do? What's the carrot?
yes, there is one. Let me tell you what it is. If what you do is you do expect and embrace change, so you identify the fact that you have neuroplastically changed and you will continue, and the world is going to ask you to do this more, like we're about to return to work offices and we're going to have to do it all over again, is come back to a very new reality, one where you have changed, the environment has changed, the world context situation has changed, but everyone you work with, they've changed too. And that's if they're the same people. Even if they're the same people, they've changed a ton. Now, here's the carrot. When what we do, and we've shown this in the neuroscience research, but what we do is we expect effectively to increase our ability to be cognitively flexible, cognitively adaptable, and resilient. We actually create a circumstance where that becomes almost like a skill set. So we are just more resilient, adaptable, flexible. And that cognitive flexibility, let's just call it one word as an example, that cognitive flexibility has actually been shown to be more predictive of personal, professional success than skill set otherwise, than intelligence or IQ, than education, as example. So the dangling carrot is if you put yourself to work saying, listen, I've changed, change is uncomfortable, other people have changed, the whole world's changed around me, but I expect it, and I'm going to produce sort of the, self-awareness, self-reflexivity, bigness of self to be able to adopt and to adapt to that. Then what we find is that's actually a skill set that develops that is more predictive of your personal and professional success than your education, and then a lot of your other skill sets, than even your experience or wisdom. I mean, that's what this modern day requires of us. And so that's the dangling carrot, is that it will help you succeed if what you can do is get to a place where you're happy to expect and embrace change.
Great, right? So I'm happy for the population at large. For me in particular, I spent a fortune going to very expensive schools, and now what I'm hearing is that isn't even the best predictor of success in the first place. Excuse me while I have a disillusionment moment. But speaking of disillusionment moments, we've got the two don'ts and the two do's. We have paying attention to ultradian rhythms, which have been changing. Don't have too high expectations about yourself. Do embrace and expect change in yourself and others, and identify and communicate your boundaries and identify others' boundaries. I want to, since we do have some time, I'd like to dig one level deeper in that and say, okay, so if I decide I'm going to do this, are there any particular practices or things that I can do? Should I start journaling? Should I take the Myers-Briggs every 3 weeks? Like, what is it that I should be doing to help me proactively do those things and embrace change and so on?
I think a lot of it, to your point, is introspection, Steve. I think what people have to do is sort of a continual, and what there's been great research on, not to demoralize you further, great research that shows that people aren't just wrong with introspection, it actually serves to depress them, that what we find does not make us happy. However, I think that if what you do is approach it with that forewarned is forearmed, approach it with kind of, this, I often say self-care is the new healthcare, sort of a self-kindness that you have to approach all this with, to say, I'm going to honor my new neural, flow and the ultradian cycling, because that's going to help me be a more sustainable and productive person. And so that's a practice of every minute, right? Like that's a practice of hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day, sort of taking it as it comes and saying, yeah, I understood that to be theoretical, then I put it to practice. It's true, I don't need as many breaks in the morning, but boy, am I flagging by 1:30, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And to your point, that's a lot of just introspection, potentially journaling. Some people I know do have diaries. There are links online you can find where basically it puts into a spreadsheet for you how your energy was and how your affect was. So that's your emotional regulation at every moment in the day, to be able to sort of determine for yourself how your ultradian cycling is different day to day, week to week, month to month. And as this is great, actually, insight as well. Researchers in Australia proved that if you do that, so if you do not even the formalized diaries or journaling, if all you do is reflect on a lot of this and sort of pay attention, forewarned, forearmed, I know this now I'm paying attention to it introspectively. actually what we see is that a lot of your brain kind of rises to the challenge and says, okay, yes, did you need me to be more productive? Did you need me to have longer attention span? Did you need me to be more emotionally regulated? It becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. Your brain is this miraculous, amazing thing that is your own masterpiece, right? You are neuroplastically and neurofunction, not just neuroanatomically, but neurofunctionally. You are your own amazing masterpiece. And so the more thought that you put into this, introspectively or otherwise, or formally, then the more likely it is that you'll neuroplastically organize yourself neurofunctionally in such a way that you become better at all these things. You become better at that ebb and flow of neural energy. You become better at understanding change, embracing it, how to adopt and adapt to it. You become better at things like how to manage your expectations in any given scenario at any given moment, identifying your boundaries, how they've changed. Like, you get better at all these things. And of course, I have so many more tips and tricks, like 20 more, in fact, that I talk about in my course, Boost My Business Brain. But it's exactly this that we discuss all day. It's basically, what do you need to pay attention to? And then how do you pay attention to it?
That's interesting because one of the things that I do, I have a daily accountability buddy who I meet with, and we each made a list and then we swapped lists. So he quizzes me on how I'm doing with all the things that are important to me. So one of the things, for example, is, did you do your ab workout yesterday? And all I have to do is say yes or no. But believe me, after I've said no too many times in a row, I start feeling more and more self-imposed pressure, but it's self-imposed because of the social context. And what you're saying, I could just easily imagine adding to my list and having him check in with me and say, okay, Stever, did you stop at the end of the day and just assess were any of your boundaries crossed? And do you need to fix that up? Or did you find that there was anything that was upsetting to you, but that was actually just you had bad expectations, you had too high expectations of yourself, or you were trespassing on other people's, like, I could imagine almost making this a daily check-in for myself, where I wouldn't spend an hour doing it. I'd spend 5 minutes doing it, but at least it would like keep me, it would start to prime me to think about the world through that lens.
And it's such a
I
great,
guess.
that was a tongue twister, accountability buddy. That was good.
Accountability
Anyway,
buddy. Yes.
accountability. And then it's not self-imposed, it's peer-imposed, right? That's the whole idea, which we know, of course, the human brain is very highly social in terms of its motivational factors. So to have someone else that you care about, and be able to impose this with you is important. Then to your point, one of the things that I often advocate is just, if every time you feel emotionally dysregulated, get out a pen and paper. So not your mobile device, not a computer, get out a pen and paper and write down what you're feeling, and then write down in the moment what you attribute that experience, that emotional dysregulation to.
In the moment.
First of all,
so like if I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, this politician is an evil person, I would write that down. Because I think in that moment, I think I'm being upset by the politician, even though it might be low blood sugar. Okay.
Right.
Sorry. Keep going.
And it might mean something greater for you ultimately, right? Like, they might be talking about something that really upsets you. But as an example, what you're doing, there's two things you're doing there. You're actually objectifying the emotion so that you can sort of call it what it is, name it how it should be named, and then you're pulling it out of yourself. So it's almost as if you're saying, I identify that I am upset right now, and I'm going to write down how I'm upset. And then you do write down what you attribute it to. And we do see a ton of attribution errors, especially under duress, especially while in emotional dysregulation moments. It's very hard to logically or with any level of clarity truly identify what really upset you. But write it down, what you think that attribution is. And then what you do is later on, you'll revisit that and you will see that, writing it down at all, just acknowledging I'm upset right now, or I'm angry, or I'm irritated. That helped you calm down. It helped almost objectify it and put it to bed. But then the second thing is the attribution will later become a lot more clear to you as either an error or as something that, that made sense. That was exactly what upset me. There was absolute clarity there. Or, you know what? To your point, it's a great example. I was low on blood sugar, or I did not get enough sleep that night, or I had had a fight with my spouse, and that just there was a whole cascade of events then that, or whatever it is, but that will kind of give you clarity into some of the patterns in your life that do cause consistent, what I consider to be non-functional emotional dysregulation. Because I think it's important to acknowledge that emotions are indeed functional, right? They're designed to help you feel so uncomfortable that you'll be motivated to act in your own self-interest. So not all emotions are bad. I mean, quite the opposite. But we need to identify where they came from in order that we can act in our own self-interest in a pro-social way, in a functional way.
So you've mentioned already that you have a program, Boost Your Business Brain. Could you tell us, if people want to get a hold of you, where can they find you? What sort of offerings do you have? If people really want to go deeper with this and use neuroscience to help transform the way that they relate to the world, the way they relate to business life, etc. Tell us how to find you, Brynn.
Yeah, thank you, Seaver. I think the best resource is drbrynn.com. There's links to everything we're up to, all the social media. I mean, I think we have every platform right now operational, but the idea that, what's coming, what's new, the newest resources, the newest writing, the newest television appearances, anything we're doing is somewhere there on drbrynn.com. And it is probably, pushed out through social media, etc. So I hope that is the easiest possible way to find out what you need and figure out how it is that I can help you boost your brain at work and in life.
That would be awesome. My brain loves being boosted. I really appreciate you taking the time today and for sharing what you have with us. And, as you know, because when we had our conversation to prepare for this, we can go on all day about this. You have an entire program on it. And I suspect that even if you have 20 different topics you cover, there's 100 more that you're not covering because there's that wealth of knowledge. Thank you again. It's been fantastic having you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve.
Take
I wish
care.
you the best. Thank you.